history isn't just what happened. It's what still matters. The decisions, the turning points, the stories that shape our present. This is history told forward. Conversations that looked back to better understand what comes next.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The History Told Forward. I'm your host, Don, and today we have got Jack Maher. Jack Maher is a historical novelist and a four-time Emmy-winning journalist whose best-selling novel, Poppy, uncovers a forgotten chapter of Colorado and Native American art history. His book tells the true inspired story of his grandfather, Eric Douglas, an early champion of Native American artists who rode horseback across the Southwest to preserve and elevate their work. Eric's life bridged worlds from advocating for native pottery and sand paintings to commanding 110 nurses in the Pacific during World War II. Jack brings decade of broadcast storytelling experiences from NBC's KUSA TV in Denver, where he served as a multimedia journalist and executive producer. Welcome to the show, Mr. Jack Maher. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing great, Don, and thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, you've got so much stuff that's going on. Why don't we start at the beginning? What brought you into the journalist world?
You know, it's a great story. I was in high school in Denver. Our high school was George Washington. And I was a junior, and I was on the newspaper staff. And the reason I was on the newspaper staff was because as a kid growing up, I loved Superman comics. And of course, Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, works at the Daily Planet. He's a reporter. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. And that sort of lured me in on a very basic level into the world of journalism. Anyway, I'm in this journalism class, and our teacher, whose name was Mrs. Mack, was looking out the window, and she noticed a news crew from the local TV station unloading their gear to do a story at our high school. I'm not sure what the story was, but she opens the window and she yells down and she says, "Hey, we're a journalism class. Can you come up and just take a few minutes and talk to us?" Well, they come up and they talk about their day and just the challenges of meeting deadlines and the adrenaline connected with this kind of storytelling they were doing. It was photographer Butch Montoya and reporter Ron Mitchell. And from that moment forward, I just knew this is what I want to do. I want to be in their world. I want to be in TV news. Well, fast forward about 8 years later, I end up working for that station that they were from that day. And I end up being Ron's supervisor and Butch's colleague. And I just couldn't believe, the turn that life had taken. But if it wasn't for their school visit, I never would have been in that world of TV news. And I was at the station for 34 years.
Wow. And
saw a lot of changes. And we started in film and ended up in digital and all the madness that goes on with the multi-platforming. But I was very proud of the work we did, and it really helped me as a writer of this book and another book in terms of just being able to find a voice that I could always depend on, that I knew I could get the job done under deadline. But that's basically how I ended up in the field.
Well, so, man, that is fascinating how right there at the school level, I mean, most people, what's the average person changes careers 4 times, 5 times throughout their life. And here you are in school and 34 years later, same place. And you don't hear that story very often.
No, I really feel in some ways that I was part of a very lucky group of folks that got to be in an industry that is somewhat reviled now. and people don't necessarily trust the way they once did. And again, I sound like an old man here, but we had 4 TV stations in Denver for a long time, and people were kind of on the same page. And now everybody's got a newsroom in their pocket, and everyone's got a voice, and that can be both good and bad. I just look back at the time that I had with great fondness and great pride in that we had some really great stories that we tried to tell. And, I'll tell you, we have on the wall of the newsroom to this day, there's a sign that says accuracy first. And that was the first thing we saw when we walked into the newsroom every day before we started our editorial meetings. And I think that's been lost a little bit with this new world in terms of fact checking and making sure the other side of things is reported. And it's a wild west in some ways. And we still have people that are committed to doing the right thing. I still believe a free press is a foundation of democracy. And I just kind of really hate to see how it has been turned into the enemy in some quarters. So I look back with a lot of pride on what I did and what my team accomplished during those years.
Yeah. I had a guest on here that pointed out something that I had never thought of personally until he said it. But, our founding fathers realized how important knowledge and speech was all the way back then when it took weeks to find out something big that was happening in not your local area. You had to wait for it to reach newspapers and into your area and somebody to write about it. And, that's the whole reason why the First Amendment is about speech and not about guns. And why, they always felt like power came from intelligence, and that involved knowledge and speech. And that was way more important than weapons. And weapons was for when you didn't have the knowledge anymore. Right. And it really made sense when they put it that way to me. But it is, knowledge is power, and it's important that everybody has the right to talk. And it's just unfortunate, like you said, that we don't have the ability to have debates and then still go have a beer afterwards and be friends, But I'm sure history repeats itself, and one day that will come back again.
Well, I appreciate your optimism. I think you're right. And that's what I believe as well.
So let me ask you, your career from storytelling and journalism, is that what kind of drew you into writing the book about your grandfather?
That's also an interesting story. I will be honest with you, Don. I didn't know a whole lot about this man, even though he was my grandfather. And the reason for that was because I was sort of a child of a dysfunctional family. My parents were alcoholics. There was also some mental illness thrown in. So it was a very chaotic, unstable environment growing up. I remember going back to my George Washington high school days, coming to school very tired because I didn't sleep very well at night because of all the arguing and crashing that was going on between my parents. And so I wasn't sure what the future really held for me. Well, that was until one day, my wonderful grandmother realized that she needed to stabilize this chaos. And she swept in, and she indeed stabilized our little family. And she was part of a magnificent world that involved this man, Eric Douglas Poppy, his love for Native Americans and their art, his appreciation of things that were beautifully made, that were rooted in traditions that dated back centuries. But she was more concerned with just making sure we had clothes on our backs and food on the table. Mm-hmm. And so she minimized that part of her life, and I didn't really know about it until one day she came into my basement bedroom. I was a long-haired hippie kid, and she had a supplement from the Denver Post, and it was called Empire Magazine, and the cover was about Eric Douglas and his family. And she said, "Here, Jack, you may want to hang on to this someday. It's about our family, and it's a pretty good story." Well, I, being a long-haired hippie kid, just folded it up and put it away in a stack and didn't think much about it until many, many years later. In the early 2000s, I was in the newsroom one day, and I got a call from the Denver Art Museum. And they said, "Are you Eric Douglas's grandson?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you may not be aware, but he's still kind of a big deal here at the Denver Art Museum. We even have a society dedicated to him. It's called the Douglas Society. And we meet a few times a year. We were wondering if you could lecture about him at our next meeting." Well, I got to tell you, my heart was racing because all I had was this Denver Post supplement, very scant knowledge about what he was all about.
Yeah.
I did a quick cram fest of what I could find. And remember, in the early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of online going on.
Yeah.
But somehow she had passed away at that point, so I wasn't able to talk to her. But somehow I was able to cobble together this lecture. And they were appreciative, but I realized by the time it was over, I had not really done this man justice, because just peeking around the edges, I realized this was an amazing story involving this man, his love for Native American art, the way he championed these artists, the way he innovated museum techniques, which are still in use to this day.
Wow.
And so I decided, well, when I finally get out of this TV life and the multimedia life, I'm going to write a book about him. And the fuel for that fire was really the death of my sweet Becky, my late wife, who passed away unexpectedly. And there's a saying we have as Catholics that you have a dark night of the soul. When something happens, it's a loss of either a person or a personal loss, maybe a medical thing. And you can either sit in the darkness or you can mine it for the gold it contains. And so I decided to do the latter. And this book was my grief project. It helped me to get to know my grandfather, and it helped me to get through the grief of losing my Becky.
Yeah. Wow. I did never, I wrote a book about my military time as well. And it was wrote as a document to share with my family about the things that I went through that I never shared with them. When I went in the military and when I got out of the military, it was the same wife, and my kids were born early in my military career. And so they knew me prior to deployments, and they knew what I turned into after the deployments. And so I wrote this as a document for them. And I never expected the healing that would come from it, and it really helped me quite a bit. And I can see how taking on a project like that would help in a time like what you were going through. So yeah, that's a big deal. And I wish a lot more people would understand, this wasn't about taking your mind off of it. This was about learning and about processing.
Well, and the choice, as you well know from your own experience, Don, is you can either go inward with it, or you can stay connected with the world. And so this was my way to get connected. I went to the Denver Art Museum to do research. They brought out boxes and boxes of stuff because these guys in the early 20th century, they were letter writers, they were diary keepers. And I had all this archival information to go through to get to know my grandfather. He lived in a beautiful home west of Denver called Hiwan, beautiful log home. I went up there. They also opened up their archives to me. And so in doing this, the research was one element. And then in writing it every day, I've had my time to grieve Becky. But then I was able to pour that grief to channel it into the creative, concern of writing a novel. And I'll tell you, if it wasn't for this book, I'm not sure where I'd be today. It got pretty dark.
This episode is brought to you by Barracks Media, where your online presence becomes a real asset. Barracks Media builds professional websites for podcasters, creators, authors, and small businesses who are ready to be taken seriously. not templates, not cookie-cutter pages. Real platforms built to grow with you. Whether you're launching a podcast, promoting a book, or building a brand, your website should work as hard as you do. We design sites that convert listeners into followers and followers into clients. Visit barracksmedia.com and turn your idea into a home on the web.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. And the part I know we're going to get into it, but man, you had to kind of be nervous when you went and did this speech, because you had to understand that you were walking into a talk about somebody that the whole audience knew very well, evidently, you know.
And I was very honest about that. I remember telling this group, you guys know more about my grandfather than I do. So keep that in mind as you're listening to me. This is going to be from a grandson's perspective.
Right.
Because again, I had this article, I had a little bit of knowledge, and my only hazy memory, my grandfather was born in 1897. He died in 1956 at the young age of he was in his 50s when he died of cancer. And that cancer had taken one of his arms. And so just as a little boy, I was 2 years old. I remember seeing this scary one-armed giant looking down at me when I'd go visit him and my grandmother. And that was my only memory of him. So getting to know him by writing this book, it was a beautiful experience for me. But you're right, that very first lecture was a little shaky, and I think I've done a better job since then, since now I have a whole lot more knowledge about him.
Yeah. Well, so your grandfather was in World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and what is it that you remember from that time frame? Because
Sure.
I mean, being a commander of 110 nurses, he wasn't a low-ranking person.
No, and his skills as a museum administrator, I think, is the reason that the Army. He was in the Army. Was the reason that they thought he would be good to help with this hospital. It was in New Hebrides during the Pacific War. And I was lucky enough to find his orders to establish this hospital with these nurses. And they shipped out from what was called Camp Carson at the time. It's now known as Fort Carson.
Yep.
In Colorado. And it was a top secret shipment. He thought that was kind of funny, referring to these nurses as a shipment. But they all boarded this train, headed west to a transport ship, and then on to New Hebrides. Had to build the hospital from scratch in the jungle. And they were treating a lot of the guys that were on the front lines of that Pacific conflict, horrific injuries physically, but also mentally, because of, just the horrors of the Pacific War. And my grandfather was a pretty sensitive guy and intuitively realized that many of these injuries, could not be seen. Of course, they called it shell shock at the time. Yeah. It's PTSD. And because he grew up in this home full of beautiful Native American art, but also religious music, his father was an Episcopal priest and music liturgist who was world renowned for his Episcopal music that is still in use by the Episcopal Church today. But he grew up in this environment, and he just intuitively knew that music could be healing. And so he organized these choirs of convalescing men that had suffered shell shock. And through this music, he helped them to reconnect with their former selves. And he would always write home to Evergreen, can you send me more scores, Pop? That's what he called his dad. So I can, keep these choirs going. And so in that respect, he was a bit of a pioneer in the terms of recognizing the need for this new kind of therapy to treat PTSD. And that was the hallmark of his entire life. He was an innovator in the museum front. He again championed these Native American artists at a time when there was a lot of racism and a lot of misunderstanding about their world and their art. And so I'm very proud of the fact that even in the military, he was able to continue that innovation this way.
This show is part of the Barracks Media Network, built by veterans, creators, and storytellers who believe stories change lives. Barracks Media produces podcasts, books, and digital content that amplify voices worth hearing. We help creators launch, grow, and monetize their message without losing their soul. If you've got a story in you, or a show in your head, go to barracksmedia.com and start building something that lasts.
So the things that he did with the art and the museums, that was before going into the war. Wow.
Yeah.
So how did he get into that part of it? Do you know?
Yes, I do. So it's an interesting story. A lot of interesting stories here tonight. But his father, as I said, was this priest, this music liturgist, and he was from the New York area, and he worked very, very hard. In fact, they found him unconscious at the base of his organ one day because he had worked through the night on something called plain song. If you've ever been in a setting where you hear the chanting of monks, that is unaccompanied music that is probably best equated to plain song. And his father thought this music could open windows into heaven itself. But as I say, he worked very, very hard to the point of exhaustion. So his superiors said, you know what? You need to go west. That was the cure back then for people back east with all kinds of problems, lung ailments, exhaustion. Go west, get out under those blue skies, under those Rocky Mountain blue skies, and get healthy. He did that. He went to a sanitarium in Denver, founded by one of Colorado's first woman doctors, who eventually fell in love with him and he with her. So she was my great-grandmother. She was known as Dr. Joe. But he realized he needed something more than traditional medicine. He took a bedroll and a horse, and he went out under the stars in the great American Southwest, and he just camped for weeks on end. And during the course of these travels, he encountered Native Americans, Hopi, especially. And he fell in love with their culture and their world, and he learned about their art. And the Hopi in particular thought this was really a very insightful guy. He didn't try to convert them to his Episcopalian faith. He met them on their terms, and they met him on their terms. So there was this bridging of cultures and of culture and world and art. But they made him a blood brother. They called him Lomowana, which translated to tall pine tree, because he was a very tall man. Well, after these encounters, he brought this love of their world, their music and their art into his home in Evergreen, this beautiful home I referenced. They had this boy, Eric, who was raised in this culture. So he just sort of had it in his DNA already from his dad to zero in on this beautiful world of pottery and leggings and sand paintings. And so he grew up understanding, why these things were so meaningful and sacred. But he didn't really come into the world of museums until one day the family had what they called cow camp suppers up in Evergreen. They'd invite the neighbors around. And remember, there was no I-70. These were dirt roads. People lived in cabins in the mountains. It was really rough to get around, but they would gather at the Douglas homestead for these cow camp suppers. And one of the guests was Ann Evans. And her name is very significant here in Colorado because her father was Governor Evans, who was infamously associated with the Sand Creek Massacre. And he's been kind of reviled since then. In fact, we used to have a Mount Evans, and now it's been renamed Mount Blue Sky as part of this. Wow, this guy wasn't really very, very nice, to put it mildly. Well, anyway, she, I think because of that, had guilt. This is my theory, but I think she had guilt about the way that not only her father had carried out this massacre, but just the way that Indian cultures were treated by white America. And so she wanted to start a Native Arts department at the Denver Art Museum. And she asked Eric, who by that time was in his 20s, would you consider being part of this effort? she was really concerned that this race of Native Americans, these different cultures, were going to be wiped out by white influence. And so she wanted to preserve them. That was her really calling in life before she felt they were wiped away. Eric did not share that concern. He really said, I think they're going to be here a lot longer than you and me. But he said, I'll help you. So he started this Native Arts Department, and he started this outreach to potters and weavers and tried to convince them that their work needed to be in a museum. They didn't understand what a museum was. There was no concept there. But because of his dad and later his own contact with them, they trusted him to do the right thing. He felt that a piece of Native American pottery by a Hopi potter had the real good pottery, had the same level of sophistication and beauty as a Greek Renaissance vase. And so with a lot of coercion on the part of the museum higher-ups, he started this Native Arts Department and devoted his life to championing them. And in so doing, also created a livelihood for these artists. Because up until that point, a lot of it was considered just souvenir trash you could get on the side of, some road in New Mexico. I mean, again, kind of the racist attitude at the time. Yeah. But he felt by elevating it in a museum, people would start to understand, no, this is quality. And he said, it's not just in a museum, but you can buy this and beautify your home. And so he helped create this livelihood for these artists as well. One of them in particular, Nampeyo, she was a Hopi potter, lived in a place called First Mesa in Arizona. And if you've ever seen these paintings, Don, of these adobe boxes with ladders going up on top of cliffs, that was the home where she lived. That was kind of the style. And she would climb down from this home into the canyon to get the special clays she needed to fire up the pots. And she used sheep dung and manure, very old Hopi method, to get a special yellow glaze to some of it. And that was the way that she honored her ancestors, by using their techniques into the 20s and 30s and 40s. And my grandfather recognized that this was the kind of thing that needed to be preserved. Something else Nampeyo did that was interesting. When she would go down to the canyon floor, she would scrounge around for old pieces of pottery that her ancestors had thrown over the side. If you ever go to Mesa Verde or some of those places, you will hear from the park rangers that was pretty routine, that once a pot had outlived its usefulness, you just tossed it over the side and it broke. And she would scrounge up these scraps and then take inspiration from what a previous artist had done, and then would sort of reinvent that pattern on her own terms for a more modern sensibility. And Eric Poppy thought that was a beautiful way of not only continuing tradition, but reinventing it a little bit for a new audience.
Yeah, it's fascinating because what we're talking about is historically people were making things out of necessity, pots to use to hold things as well, that later became art. And then later that art even became reinvented and put in museums and so forth. So it went from having an item that you needed for cooking or holding things to making things that you could sell to make a livelihood, to eventually being recognized as true art and put in museums and told a story of the history that led it to there. So,
well, and as I mentioned, if you go to the Denver Art Museum today, and I hope you do, or your listeners will get the chance to do someday, it is really one of the premier, if not the premier, destination for Native American art in the world. And that was a lot of Eric Douglas. That was his work. He ended up himself buying a lot of this because he had the resources. The family was wealthy. They had land holdings in Michigan that later part of the Ford Motor Company was built on top of. So
wow.
they had money, but they used it in this pursuit. And so he would buy the top quality leggings and flutes and war bonnets and as I say, pottery to put in the museum. And you'll see to this day, a lot of that material has his name or his father's name on it. And if I could just tell you for a minute some of the ways he innovated the displays of it. He felt that museums at the time in the early 1900s were only of interest to eggheads. That's what he said, that just only eggheads would want to come here. So he wanted to break these display cases. He wanted to make sure it wasn't just this flat, boring, white, four-walled experience. And he brought in pedestals, and he used lighting and niches. In the case of some of these pots from the Hopi, he would paint the backgrounds to match the source. So if Nampeyo was down on a yellow desert floor looking for clay, he would paint the background of that pot yellow. And these techniques, as I say, evolved with the help of a colleague of his in New York, René de Harnecourt, who was with the Museum of Modern Art. And he and Eric were on these parallel paths. They both wanted to reinvent the museum experience, make it more interactive. And so by accident, in a way, they were developing these similar pathways. Well, the two of them got together finally in 1939 at this really interesting exhibition. It was called the Golden Gate Expo, and it was to celebrate the opening of the Golden Gate and Oakland Bay bridges. And as part of it, they created an artificial island. This is so fascinating to me. An artificial island in San Francisco Bay. The Army Corps of Engineers did this. They built it up out of shoals. And onto this island, they put pretty much a World's Fair. It was temporary. The only way you could get out there was by water taxi. And Eric and his friend René were charged with constructing what was called the Indian Court, a celebration of Indian culture and art. And so these techniques that they pioneered in Denver and New York, they were able to take to a whole new level in San Francisco. And so when you'd go in, the first thing you would see is this beautiful mural of a Cheyenne war party on horseback. And they decided to go one step further. They made the feathers on the chief real. And they implanted the feathers in the wall, and then they ran a tube of compressed air hidden up the side. And so the feathers rippled as if they were riding in the wind toward you. Think about that, 1939. Innovative then, innovative today.
Yeah.
They would bring in Native American artists and creators to show how they did a piece of silver, how they did a sand painting. And it was really key in the case of the sand painters that they left out certain details, because in the culture of the Navajo and others that use sand paintings, they are sacred and they are used for healing. The idea is that you put the person that is afflicted in the middle of the painting. When you're done, the sand is the paint. And then you sweep up the sand, the different colored sand, and daub it on the body to heal. Well, they made sure if it was just for this exhibit that, they would leave out a key detail so it would not be sacred. But because of this expo in 1939, it again really furthered America's understanding of why this was important art. They repeated the experience in 1941 in New York at MoMA, and Eleanor Roosevelt came to this exhibit. And she praised both Eric, my grandfather, and René de Harnecourt for all the work they'd done, because they duplicated underground ceremonial Hopi kivas in this exhibit. So if you're going through this, you have to go down a ladder to see the art inside a kiva, which is basically a hole in the desert. And I'm just looking at the different ways that these men operated and helped with this understanding of Native American culture. I'm amazed at how much they got done in a very short amount of time. Yeah,
they were generations ahead of themselves. I mean,
very much so.
Yeah. I wonder, how much of the things that he was doing, because it's obvious that your grandfather had the ability to think outside the box, right? He didn't just satisfy with that's what that person did, so that's how I'm going to do it, or that's how it was done in the past. This is how we're going to do it now. You know, I wonder how much of that he incorporated with his leadership in the military, because like you said, the fact that he was bringing in music that is used for therapy even today for PTSD and stuff like that. It's just so fascinating of how far forward thinking he was.
Well, I know one thing, that when he was stationed in New Hebrides, he developed a new appreciation for oceanic art, Polynesian art. And he brought some of that back to the Denver Art Museum after his war service ended. So the Native Arts Department grew to beyond Native American art to include oceanic art as well. We're talking, you know, tikis, wood carvings, things like that. And he had a very special relationship with these nurses, I have to tell you, Don. Again, think of the time, okay? Mm-hmm. But his name, you know, his family name, we called him Poppy. But somehow, as you know, being in the military, sometimes these things get a little bit convoluted or inverted. They ended up calling him Pappy, mm-hmm. and he called these nurses his chicks. So it was Pappy and his chicks, because he felt they were kind of needed of guidance, a father figure, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And at the end of their service together in that hospital, he wrote just a charming little booklet, because he was also a poet. And he composed a few lines for every one of those 110 nurses. Just, you know, a little memento for them to take from their service together, from their time together. And they got together as, you know, a group for reunions for many years until he died. And, you know, he didn't ever want to make the spotlight on him. And even after he was diagnosed with this cancer, he never let on to them, you know, how truly sick he was. It was always an optimistic report about, you know, how he was doing and everything else. He clearly was not doing well with the one arm off, and, you know, he was just looked awful. And the courage that he showed at the end, he was still in demand because of all this vast knowledge. And so museums from not only the United States, but overseas wanted him to come and authenticate their collections or help determine, hey, we have this opportunity to get this war bonnet. Is it something we should spend money on? And he could tell you if it was the real thing or maybe just a knockoff. Well, as part of this research, I came across a museum in Wisconsin, the Beloit Museum of Anthropology. And I said, do you know that my grandfather, you know, was there in the 50s? There's a reference to him visiting and helping authenticate this collection. They said, well, yeah, we've got an audio tape of him doing it. Don, my heart leapt, because I had never heard his voice. And wow. Here now I have this opportunity. So I talked to the museum. They said the tape's in pretty bad shape, but maybe you can find a way to clean it up. So I had it sent to an audio lab in Salt Lake City. They sent me the digital file. And when I opened it and I heard him authenticating this collection, it was a voice I was surprised by. It was deep. It was warm. It was full of humor. As he went through the different items, and he would give a little mini lecture about every single one. He had the one arm, like I said, but he wanted to show the museum director how this particular tin whistle was used in a ceremonial dance. So he would beat with his one hand while he blew the whistle. And that's on the tape. And, you know, if nothing else, besides this being a way for me to deal with the loss of my Becky, it was worth it to get that tape, to hear his voice, to really connect with him as his grandson.
Yeah. Wow. That is amazing. I've just been sitting here in awe listening to this, because, you know, very few people have stories like this. And I've had, like I said, I've had several people that can talk about history on other podcasts and and very few are as intimate as these are. I had a guest on that the house that he lived in was built, and his family fought in the Civil War, and the house was built during the Civil War, and his whole family had been there the whole time. So the generations, it did travel down as far as the stories and the battles that happened in that area and all that stuff. And he's probably one of the only other people I could think of on the top of my head that has such a passionate story to tell.
Well, thank you.
So I know we're getting closer to the top of the hour here, but how did you've had a successful career in broadcasting, and what pushed you towards fiction as far as going into writing and so forth?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, the reason I made this a novel, it could have been a nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you, everything in here happened. The people are real. There may be one or two that I kind of did a hybrid combination. But the reason I made it a novel was really a piece of research that I could not come up with an answer for a very big question that I had.
Okay.
When Poppy and his dad were on one of these trips to the Southwest, they went through Monument Canyon in 1921, and they were they had a mule train for all their supplies. And my great-grandfather, the priest, kept a diary. And he wasn't the most effusive writer. Mm-hmm. At the entry was typically, well, we covered 12 miles today. We found good grass and water for the mules and the horses. A couple of Navajo sheep herders were staring at us as we went through the canyon. And then this one entry, and we rescued a mule from a pine tree, period. Well, I had no one to ask, obviously. What? You rescued a mule from a pine tree? I have to put that in the book, but I don't have the facts surrounding it, so I had to use my imagination about how did the mule get in the pine tree and how do you get him out? And it's kind of an elaborate sequence in the book. So that was really the one thing that kept me from making this a nonfiction book. But I think in some ways it also freed me up to perhaps, you as the writer are obviously going to be injecting a bit of your heart and your soul into what you create.
Yeah.
And so I think that allowed me to also to, in some of the dialogue and whatnot, to, put a little bit of me in there as well. And to try to make it just as the way my grandfather tried to meet people where they were in the 20th century. I wanted to try not to make it modern, but maybe a little more accessible to people in the 21st century now. Also, with TV broadcast writing, you try to keep the sentences brief. We had what was called the one breath rule, so that if you couldn't say it in one breath, it's too long. And that actually helped me in the pacing of this. I think that informed it. So I had the TV background as a basis. I had all of these facts. I also had an oral history from my aunt, which was very helpful, talking about the early days. And I think all of that combined really gave me a good place in which to write this book. And I think also I needed to be at this age, I'm turning 72 in May, to really have the perspective and the wisdom to look back and write about him in a way that I think honors him, but also tells the truth.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense to me too, as far as why you turned it fiction. The one thing I just can't help to wonder, right, is it's ironic that you talk about saving the mule from a pine tree, right? But the native name that your grandfather was also given was Pine Tree.
I had never connected that. Oh my gosh, you're right. Wow.
I wonder if those had something to do with each other, but
Yeah, that's crazy. Oh, wow. That is amazing, Don. Thanks for that. Why did that never occur to me? I don't know.
yeah, I was just wondering, when I was listening, but yeah, absolutely. I'm going to have to invite you to Spirits of Stories as well. So we can definitely go more in depth and make it video as well. Because Jack, your story is just amazing. And I'm so fascinated.
I'm lucky to be part of a family that has this history. I'm immensely proud of what he accomplished, what my grandmother also did on a personal level, as I've discussed. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So thank you again for having me on your show. And I would be happy to be on anything else that you would like to put me on, Don. You're a good guy.
All right. I appreciate that, Jack. Well, let me ask this. Is there a place where can people go to get your books and follow you and all that good stuff?
You bet. Well, again, if you just put in the search bar Poppy and my name, Jack Maher, Maher, it'll come up. It's Amazon. I've got a website. There's a lot of different things that are out there. I will say on my website, using my multimedia experience, I have some video pieces connected to all of this because I actually did a story about the family home up in Evergreen and how to this day it is used as a wonderful educational resource for Colorado school kids to come up and learn not only about my family, but about that part of Colorado's history in Evergreen. And just as if you're ever in Colorado, I hope you visit the Denver Art Museum. I hope you'll consider visiting the Highwan Heritage Park, our family home, beautiful log home in a ponderosa pine forest in Evergreen. And you'll learn a lot about, as I say, Eric and all those wonderful people that came through his life and by extension, my life.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure that we get all of your links and everything in there for everybody to find you as well. Jack, I appreciate you coming on again, and I'm going to make sure we get you on something where we can do video and make it a little bit more longer and in depth. So,
okay.
I think this is a story that's going to resonate with a lot of people, and I know it resonated with me, especially, just the how forward thinking your grandfather was. I'm really fascinated. So, again, I appreciate you coming on and thank you for sharing your story.
You bet, Don. It's been an honor.
All right. You all take care. I hope all of y'all get something out of this. I know I sure did. And if you didn't, then rewind it and listen to it again, because you missed it. And I think everybody can say, history plays a big part in our lives. And if only podcasting existed for George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, just think of the things that we could have learned. So y'all take care. Be safe out there. And we'll see you on our next episode. Y'all take care. Bye.
You've been listening to History Told Forward, a podcast from the Barracks Media Network. Thanks to our guest for sharing their insight, and thank you for listening. You can find more conversations like this across the Barracks Media Network. We'll see you next time.